Good morning, everyone. So we are continuing through the reproductive system, and in the female reproductive system, we are left with this particular content. We call them as uterus, and then we are going to cover the umbilical cord for the day that covers the reproductive system for us. Now, this uterus, the gross part we already have studied. I have got like a fundus body and the cervix, which is continued down to the vagina or vaginal tracts, and this has a sidewise expansions, which is known as this fallopian tube. We learned about the fallopian tube other day, the histology of it. Now, this particular uterus we are going to talk about is micro anatomy of it, or the sectional anatomy of the uterus. It has got three layers, inside out or outside in. So, it has a lumen or cavity inside to it. We call them as uterine cavity. So, the cavity is surrounded by this particular layer of cells. We call them as endometrium. So, most inside we have the lumen, and then we have a layer we call them as endometrium. This particular endometrium in this uterus is most receptive and more dynamic or more changing layer that we have. Now, then deep to this endometrium we have this myometrium, that means muscle layer, and then we have the outside layer we call them as perimetrium, which is covered by the serous layer, which is serosa, or this the mesenteric folds which is covering or wrapping to it, making this particular outer covering to it. The most extensive layer that you are going to see here in this endometrium, this is takes like more than 2/3 of that particular specimen, nearly close to the more than half of it. We are going to see this endometrium. Then we have muscle and very thin layer of the perimetrium is there. Now, what this endometrium or inner layer is consisting of, like what you are going to see. Now, this particular endometrial inner layer, just like anywhere, we have a cellular layer. That means we have this particular lining epithelium which is present to it. Now, once you have the lining epithelium, that means the cells are there. Deep to that, we have this tissue space. We call them as lamina propria. That means that particular region we have the lamina propria, and then we have this particular basement membrane which is related to it. Now, in here, this mucosal lining which is present in here, which consists of the cell, we call them as lining epithelium, which is a cuboidal cells, which is two columnar cells which is present in a single layer. So, we call them a simple columnar to cuboidal cell epithelium which is present, and then we have this particular lamina propria. Now, what is the lamina propria? That basically defines this particular uterus. It is filled up with tons of glands which is present to it. So, we are going to see some glands which is extensively present and which is pouring into this particular endometrial covering or endometrial epithelium layer. Now, this particular glands which looks like a tube, that means it is kind of like cylindrical tubes, that particular tube it has, and that particular tube has a cavity to it, and it has a lining cells which is again lined by the same simple columnar epithelium, and they have that like a vascularity which is present to it. That means to supply this particular endometrium, we have a gross blood supply present. That means the arterial and the venous network that is present in this particular endometrium, and this endometrium substance are there which is known as endometrial stroma. That means where this particular the lamina propria is having this, that means connective tissue which is present to it. So, this is the endometrium that is concerning to us, or that is what we will be focusing in the slides. Then deep to that we have the muscle layer. These particular muscles are smooth muscles. They are differently directed in these layers, inner longitudinal, outer longitudinal, and middle layer which is irregular. That means they are crisscrossly arranged. So, we have a longitudinal muscle layer, inner and outer, in between intervened by some middle layer which is irregularly spaced muscle layer. So, we have three differently arranged muscle layers which is present, and this is like a quite thick in this particular layer which is present to it. And this particular perimetrium, which is outer covering covered by this peritoneum, have got like mesothelial cells which is covering to it. Now, to make this particular endometrium which we have referred, that which you are going to see, that what we are going to identify here. Now, what do you mean by the endometrium? That means this innermost lining layer, that means the lumen, then we have the endometrium, then which is lined by the cells, which is the columnar cells which is present to it, and then we have these blood vessels, then we have these particular vascular structures, and then we have the stroma, and within the stroma we are going to find tons of these glands. Now, this particular endometrium, depending on like how they are present, we can classify it into 3 zones. We call them a stratum compactum, we call them stratum spongiosum and stratum basale. Now, out of this 1, 2 and 3 layer, this basale layer is close to the muscle layer, that means it is deeply placed, and this compactum and the spongiosum, they are present on the top side or above to the lumen side. Now, this compactum and spongiosum, they are very responsive to the hormones. That means the estrogens and the progesterones that is secreted from this particular ovarian remnants, that we call them as corpus luteum. They are producing the hormones which is coming through it and making some changes in this particular endometrial layer, especially the upper 2 layers of the endometrium, which you call them as stratum compactum and stratum spongiosum, which is responsive. That means the changes are seen in these 2 layers. Basale, which is the bottommost part, which is resting on the muscle layer, is relatively less responsive. What do you mean by responsive? That means if you are putting some stimulus, it is going to show some changes. We call them as response. That means if I touch it, you just look here, oi, touching, somebody is responsive. So, if you are putting some kind of hormones to it, it shows some changes. That is why we call them as responsive layer. And this basale layer is less responsive, like means just like rhino. I shake him, then after 1 hour you say, oh, somebody knocked me, something like that. So, it is kind of like a slowly responsive, right. So, this is stratum basale. The changes is slow or less in this layer. With what changes? With respect to the hormones, they show some changes. Now, what changes we are referring here, that is the next point. Now, histologically, we see that this endometrium goes in cyclical changes in respect to the exposure to the hormones. Now, they go through these 2 or 3 changes phases, we call them as proliferative phases, and then we call them as secretory phase, and then we call them a shading phase or menstrual phase. So, this particular endometrium goes through 3 phases. Phase number 1, proliferative phase, where it is recovering after period or after menstrual period. So, where they are making some kind of changes, damage or repair work is going on within this endometrium. Which layers of the endometrium? Principally these 2 layers, topmost layer, compactum and spongiosum. So, these 2 layers are showing some initial part of the periodical cycle, shows some kind of repair regions, where this endometrium is breached, where these particular glands are kind of shed, where this blood vessels is lost, it is showing some kind of repair works are going on. Then this particular glands which is present to it with the exposure to the hormones, what hormones we are going to talk later on, it shows some kind of proliferations or showing some growths. We call them as glandular epithelium proliferation. And then we have this particular vascular changes as well. That means some arteries and the veins which is present to it, they are going to get some kind of momentum, or they are going to some sort of changes or enlargements or showing some more vascularity. So, this is what we call them as proliferative phase of endometrium. Now, after this proliferation, this particular proliferations or the changes goes on a high pitch. That means the proliferation is magnified afterwards, after some time. Then that phase we call them as secretory phase, where there is glands which is present becomes even more powerful or even more bigger glands, the blood vessels which are present even grow bigger, and this particular gland starts to produce some secretions which is known as the endometrial gland secretions. So, these glands becomes like coiled and tortuous, twisted, and this particular things starts to accumulate some kind of substances which starts to secrete these fluid rich substances. Now, this particular arteries which is present becomes very tortuous, becomes very engorged, and vascularity also increases. This is phase 2, we call them as secretory phase. And then after this phase is over, if the fertilization does not take place, then this particular hormonal exposure suddenly cuts off, because that particular ovum, once these things are not fertilized, this corpus luteum becomes corpus luteum and it becomes scar, albicans we talked about. If this particular pregnancy happens or implantation happens, this particular corpus luteum becomes corpus luteum of pregnancy and it stays till the placenta is formed, and that particular corpus luteum of pregnancy starts to produce the hormones, keeps going on. So, this particular secretory phase remains that particular region, arrested that, and this particular things goes on till the hormonal stimulations is there. If this particular fertilization or implantation does not take place, then it moves to this particular shedding phase, that we call them as all these cells, all these particular glands, all these particular arteries, they suddenly cut loose of the funds. What funds? Whatever the hormones that is producing here is no more there, and this particular, which is proliferations or the secretory phase, what this momentum has achieved suddenly shrinks, gets avascular, and slowly it starts to shed off. That is why we call them as menstrual shedding off. That comes with the bleeding, we call them as periodic menstrual bleeding. It comes with the proteolytic hormones, which is breaking down this particular layer. Which layer? The stratum compactum and spongiosum. These two layers are maximum responsive to this. Basally, principally remains this particular more or less same. Does not have much of changes because they are lowerly placed, and this hormone receptive cells or hormone receptive changes are less in this particular region. So, this is what we learn about this particular phases of this particular uterus depending on these endometrial changes that we see. So, whatever the story we are talking here is focused on the endometrium, that means innermost layer. We are not referring to the muscle layer, we are not referring to this particular outer side layer. So, this endometrium, that is what we are going to see. Whatever this particular slide is projecting, we will be focusing on the endometrium and we will be identifying this particular endometrial content like glands and the blood vessels into this particular 3 layer or endometrial layer. Now, coming from this particular phases, this is what we are seeing here. So, see that there are different stages of these glands, how it should be looking like. This is a schematic picture. Now, most time what you are seeing here, the menstrual time or post-menstrual time, after the menstrual period or shedding is over, then we have this particular phase, which is begin with we have this one. So, after this menstrual period, these are the glands, they are lined by these cuboidal cells, columnar cells which is present to it, and the glands is this tiny. And after this phase goes into proliferative phase with this particular hormone stimulating, this glands grows bigger and taller, becomes enlarged, and then there are further maturation going on the secretory phase, where this particular glands really becomes really big, tortuous, and starts to produce some kind of secretions through it. We call them as secretory phase. So, this is how the gland should be looking like depending on these particular different phases of this menstrual period. Which glands? This endometrial glands, that means inner side, this lamina propria or this particular matrix, they are holding this particular glands. What else? Along with the glands, we are going to see the vascular changes. That means the blood vessels which are present will be there enlarged, engorged, tortuous, etc., which is supplying to this particular gland, so that more nutrition is coming and this is really growing more. So, this is how this particular glands which is showing here in this particular initial phase, where this particular shedding is over, initial recovery phase, we call them as proliferative phase. And this particular glands, as you see here, these are the glands that you are seeing, and this is compared to this one becomes larger, bigger, wider, and filled up with the secretory element. You see this particular tiny dots, these are the blood vessels, these are less prominent here, and you can see they are enlarged, engorged, having light of tons of blood which is flowing through. Now, this is what we are referring here is the endometrial layer. So, this is the lumen side, then this is endometrium. How far this endometrium is extending? From here to all the way here. So, you see the extent of this is the cell layer only lining epithelium, simple columnar, and rest thing is lamina propria. This lamina propria is filled up with glands. What is we call them as uterine glands, because what you are seeing here is uterus. The glands are present in the endometrium only, and this region we call them as lamina propria. Then we have the basement membrane lying over this particular region probably, and then we have the muscle layer, which is we are not referring here, we just know that there are longitudinal muscles and the differently directed muscles are there. We call them as myometrium layers. So, this is what we call them as hormone responsive endometrium, and out of that this upper table, like upper 2/3 of it or more than upper 2/3 is more responsive to the hormone changes. This one we call them as stratum basale, less responsive. These upper layers are showing maximum changes. So, this particular gland, if you point it here, becomes in the late phase, we call them as proliferative phase, then it becomes this coily. You see that, this coily? So, it becomes secretory phase. So, depending on this, how this status of the gland is, we can assume or identify this particular endometrial cycle. Now, coming to this particular thing, as you are seeing in real pictures. So, this particular phase is, you can identify, this is less vascular, less prominent glands are there, which is present in these particular layers, and this is, you can compare with, the glands are bigger, wider, have lumens because they have the secretions to it, and extended and grossly vascular channels are present on it. So, this is the secretory phase and this is pre-secretory, that means this is a proliferative phase that we are referring here. And once this secretory phase is achieved, after that it will be shading off to menstrual period if this hormonal influence is cut off. Now, out here what you have to know, that what are the different hormones that control the two phases. Now, this particular leading hormone which is making this particular proliferative phase to grow in is estrogen, and the secretory phase is predominantly controlled by the progesterone hormone. These are MCQs that you have to know. In physiology, they ask more about these hormonal changes, the changes whatever they are present, and whatever the things they are present in terms of like the differences that are present to the uterine glands in the proliferative phase and secretory phase. So, these hormonal changes which is bringing in here estrogen and progesterone together, summarily they are bringing these two changes. The two hormones are there, predominantly in the first phase is contributed by estrogen. Later on, the progesterone takes form the estrogen and starts proliferating in a higher pace till it reaches to the top level, then it cuts off, reaches to this particular progesterone and estrogen, both of them are shuts down, and then we have this particular, the phase we call them as the shading phase, also known as menstrual phase. So, this hormone which is controlling this particular proliferative phase of this endometrium and this particular progesterone which is present to it, we have to understand, we have to know. What is the epitome? Is epitome of this particular limiting thing about the estrogen and the progesterone is controlled by this particular hormone, we call them as LH, luteinizing hormone. That luteinizing hormone, one speaks here, that indicates that particular presence of the ovulation, and after that what happens to the ovum, that decides the fate of the hormonal balance. If this particular ovum gets this particular sperm to fertilized with, then we have this particular corpus luteum of pregnancy. If it is not, then this particular hormone shuts down after a while and the corpus luteum becomes corpus albicans, scar tissues, and doesn't move anymore, produces the hormone, and slowly they are going to get into shading phase. So, this is what you have to know, basic three things, three layers of the uterus: endometrium, myometrium, perimetrium. Endometrium have got simple columnar epithelium cells and this lamina propria filled with arteries and tubular glands. How these particular glands in different phases that we have mentioned. In physiology, they focus in this particular parts about it. The hormonal changes, how these things are coming into it, proliferative phase, estrogen predominant, then secretory phase which is done by this particular progesterone principally, slowly phasing off, then we know none of them is there, then we have this menstrual phases. So, this is what you have to remember, that is what you have to understand in this particular context whenever you identify. So, whenever you are given this particular slides, identify the lumen side. Once you identify the lumen side, then you go for endometrium. Endometrium, you have the lining cell, then you have this whole endometrium extending up to this muscle layer. After the muscle layer, we have this outside layer which is present to it. So, this is how we are going to narrate this particular female reproductive tract organ, we call them as uterus. Then we are going to learn about a small tissue sample which is again very easy to identify. We call them as umbilical cord, which is a venous channel or a channel which is communicating with this fetal subject to this particular placenta, and it holds two structures. We call them as umbilical artery and umbilical vein. So, this umbilical artery and umbilical vein, that is you are going to find, and that is present or floating into a connective tissue substance, we call them as Wharton's jelly. So, this particular umbilical vein and umbilical artery, they are wrapped around or floating around a connective tissue or primitive connective tissue, we call them as Wharton's jelly, which is known as mucoid connective tissue. So, which is present in between these particular veins and the arteries. How do they look like? So, this is a covering of this particular amnion chorion, which is known as the placental membrane. Then we have these particular things covered, and floating in here is a jello-like substance. We call them as Wharton's jelly. What is the Wharton's jelly? A mucoid connective tissue. Within this particular Wharton's jelly, we are going to find the umbilical vein and umbilical arteries. So, out here, what you are going to see this particular, the umbilical artery which is present to it and umbilical veins which are present to it. Now, these arteries having this particular layers, we call them as tunica media. This tunica media which is prominently present, whereas in the veins we do not have this particular tunica media prominently present. So, we are going to find this particular umbilical vein which is present of course into this region, and this tunica media do not have this muscle. So, they have a wider lumen and a thin kind of like a membrane or thin like of wall that is present to these particular veins, and in between them we have the Wharton's tissue or Wharton's things are there. So, we have one umbilical artery to be present in this eventually, and two umbilical veins, they are present eventually whenever this particular specimen is matured enough. Initially it was 2 and 2, later on one thing is left and one thing is absorbed. Eventually this thing transforms into some fetal content or fetal structures, but histologically at schematically this is how we are going to see. So, this particular umbilical arteries, if they are present, you are going to see this particular remnant having a narrow lumen. His lumen is small. If you are going to see the veins, they are like this, they are wide lumen, and this particular lining this tunica media is thinner, this one is thicker. Now, this surrounding tissue we call them as Wharton's jelly. Now, wherever you are going to focus, we are going to focus any of these particular vessels, whichever it is there, and this particular vessels, umbilical vein and artery, whatever thing is there, we focus the part of it and Wharton's jelly to focus to identify. What we asked to identify in here is this Wharton's jelly. So, this is Wharton's jelly that we are going to see, identify it as a mucoid connective tissue, which is the primitive one, and this is how this particular things looks like, a kind of like a network of like a mucoid element into which floating this particular umbilical vessels. So, this particular thing is focused in this. In a single focus, we cannot bring the artery and the vein together. So, either we will be focusing in the vein, which is this one having a wide lumen of the vein, narrow lumen of this artery can be identified based on how they are present. So, if you see the lumen sleek like this thin, it has to be an artery. If the lumen, if is like wide, it has to be vein. And in between we have this connective tissue. Whenever you are focusing, we will be focusing part of it like this one with the lumen and this Wharton's jelly which will be focused on, because this is, we cannot focus in the small magnifications. So, this is how it should be looking like whenever you are seeing this. A part of it you will be looking at and part of it things you should be looking into this patient. So, we have two specimens in this microscopes are there. Two are there for the uterus, which is very self-describing because of this particular endometrium and these glands and the vessels. And this one, you just like a look into it, is kind of one of the very easy slide that you are going to identify. You have to identify this particular like one of these particular arteries that is present to it, and this Wharton's jelly tissue, they are looking like exactly like this in the specimen. Pink, light pink specimens, they have got this kind of spindle sepal mesenchymal cells. That's why they appear kind of like dots like this. These are the nucleus of the spindle shaped cells that is present, and this is kind of like a mesenchymal tissues, connective tissue which is present to it. So, go to the slides and check them out, take a picture and identify this.